Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank each one of you for, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored that you are here. Um, this is definitely a moment in my journey as a DEI director, as a Black woman, where for the first time, I'm actually called into a conference such as this. So I thank you so much for being my first audience in this platform. And please feel free during the presentation to write your questions in the chat and also to participate in the end with Q&A. If you would, one of the, for my background, my name is Alecia Thomas, Dr. Alecia Thomas, and I have been in the educational field 21 years, 21 to 22 years. I was 18 years in my early career, started very young at a predominantly white private Jesuit high school in Connecticut. I was a social studies teacher, and then soon after that, I became the diversity director. And currently, I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Brunswick School in Greenwich, Connecticut. Brunswick is a school that serves pre-K through 12 boys. So if to start off today, I know it is 3 o'clock and it's the end of some of our days, it's the beginning of others. I do not want to assume, but in the chat bar, for the sake of authenticity, would you mind, and you don't have to share, how you showed up today? It could be tired, it could be energetic. I will tell you that for me, I am happy, I am excited, but I'm also nervous. Andrea, tired and happy to be here, definitely. Trisha, eager to learn. Thank you so much. Ready to learn. Thank you. 2 papers for grad school to complete, Stacy, and so that's on my mind. I completely understand that, being a recent graduate of my doctoral program. Ready, thank you. I have some energy, but excited to learn. Thank you so much. Conflicted time-wise, yes, that's always seemed to be what's happening these days. Thank you so much for everyone, openness and willingness to listen to the presentation and to allow yourselves to be present in this moment with me. We know that we can definitely be elsewhere, but you have chosen to share in this moment. Excited for the info from Kansas City. Yes, I watched it last night. I did. And I honestly, the Buffalo Bills, they have not won an NFL since the 60s. So I was rooting for the Buffalo Bills. I must admit, they won in the 60s when it was the AFL, the American Football League, but definitely not in the NFL. So I was rooting for them. I could not stay up so late to watch it. So I watch the news this morning, but I am happy to see that they won, and I'm super excited for the quarterback. If he gets them a win, I mean, can you imagine? He's going to be coined the next Tom Brady. I also watched the Buccaneers. I think that's the team that Tom Brady's on. I was forced to watch that, and I was super happy for him because he made a huge decision and a commitment, and it really paid off. You could tell I watched. So for full disclosure, I have 2 boys. I have a 2-year-old and I have a 8-year-old who loves football, motivated, excited to learn. Sarah Burdett is on this call. Sarah is my mentor. So thank you, Sarah, for being here, for giving me this energy and giving me this vibe. So I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, everyone. Okay, let's see. Let's make sure this works. Okay, let's see here. Cancel. Can everyone see this? Thumbs up? Okay. And I practiced this numerous times because I did not want it to be a mishap. But today's presentation talks civil discourse. I don't want it to be so formal or formally minded, is the emotional support of Black students in predominantly white schools. When I pondered how to title this presentation, um, full disclosure, I sent this presentation to one of my students who were enrolled at the predominantly white high school where I used to be prior to my current position now. And he said to me, he said, how comfortable do you think your audience is going to be when they see the word Black and they see the word white? And I said to him, I purposefully did not put African American, right? I did purposefully also did not codify it by putting African American Black. We are all a part of the Black community. We're all a part of the Black diaspora. Oftentimes when you see African American or Afro-Caribbean, that speaks to the ethnicity, but the experience of Black America, no matter, it's microcosm in a sense that you may experience it differently, but systemically, you're approached the same way. And also with white, I also say to people that we should be comfortable with saying the word Black. I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation when someone says the word Black and it's like they whisper it, or they try to say it, but it's interesting because they say it, then they apologize before they say it. But when we say the word white, there is no apology. So we should be able and we should be comfortable to say that. I was drawn to this topic because number one, I'm a Black woman, so I do bring myself into the context of this. Also, in my entire life, I also taught at a predominantly white school. And the population that I was most drawn to were the young Black boys in the school. Because when you're looking at populations, when you look at data and you see data where, the representation of Black students, you have 2% Black, you have 5% Black, out of a total population of 1,000, you may have 80% Black students. And so I always wondered, and I was a teacher in the classroom, but I always wondered how those students felt. I wondered how they felt co-curricular. I wonder what they're bringing into the school, if we're able to identify with them. And so that has always been a question that I had and always a concern, to be honest, as to whether or not we're fully meeting the needs of these students. We know academically that the school is sound, but I always wonder emotionally if they're sound. So the overarching question to consider for today is, how do Black males perceive emotional support while enrolled in a predominantly white school? The reason why I asked the question the way that I did is, how do they perceive emotional support, right? Because institutionally, we can have all these practices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can have all these practices of making sure the metrics look the right way. We can have all these practices of, well, if we're going to admit one, we need to admit two. We can speak about affinity groups. We can do all those different things, but I wonder if we ever considered asking them, how do they feel? What is their perception of emotional support, right? And so throughout my years, when I was in graduate school, I wanted to understand African-American history. That was one of my goals. But I always wanted to understand history through the eyes of the marginalized population. So when I was in graduate school, my passion then as a Black woman was to understand African-American history through the lens of Black women. Right? So what I went in, I did my capstone of understanding Black history through the lens of Black women as it was told from the civil rights all the way up to, I'm going to date myself now, but to the late 90s. And it was quite interesting because what I was able to gather was the perception right? The perception of these Black women during that time period, and really understanding the history through their lens. So with that, this notion of a constructivist understanding, the learned experience was always something that I wanted to do. So when it came to my doctoral dissertation, and now the passion that I have being in this school, I wanted to know what was the experience like for Black males. And I did not want to assume. So I went directly to the source. So that's one of the things that I wanted to think about. What are their perception of emotional support? Now, just a few facts and figures, and I found this on the United States Educational Statistics Report. And this was from 2017, 2018. It was actually published April 2020. So I can assume that this is the latest data, but it says about 79% of all public school teachers were non-Hispanic or white. 7% were non-Hispanic Black, and 9% were Hispanic. I won't show you the table for the sake of today. Among private school teachers, about 85% were non-Hispanic, white 3% were non-Hispanic, and Black were 7%. 3% were non-Hispanic Black, and 7% were Hispanic. Now, if you look at the Black students, and for the sake of this study, I'm going to talk about Black males, the sake of this presentation. If you think about the fact that if they're in a predominantly white school, but then they also have teachers who don't look like them, students who don't look like them, an institution who does not, in some cases, and we're going to talk about that later in the presentation as when it comes to best practices, may not take their individual identity, their being into consideration. Can you imagine what it might feel like for these students? Oftentimes, institutionally, we try to solve the problem for them, right? We assume if we bring in more students, if we hire more teachers, then it's okay. And it might be, but do we really know unless we really ask them, that population to whom we serve? So I would like for you to watch this video before I go on. Is that okay? It's called Pondering a Place to Belong. Can you see it? Can you see me trying to get to it?
Lane Diagardi.
Okay.
My older brother, Caleb, and I have been playing competitive AAU basketball ever since I was 8 years old and he was 9. And now we are immensely blessed to be in a position to play high-level Division I college basketball. He now being a freshman for the Penn State Nittany Lions, and I'm heading to play at Vanderbilt next year in the SEC. AAU is just another way of saying that we played for a club. One cold November night in 2011, basketball practice had concluded and we had begun the hour-long drive home. Caleb was 10 years old now, and I was 9. Practice was in Baltimore City, about an hour from where we live in Westminster, Maryland. Westminster is a predominantly white populated town in northern Maryland. As we made our way back home, Caleb and I had fallen asleep. Caleb sat in the passenger seat while my father drove, and I was in the seat behind my father. We were wearing hooded sweatshirts, and because it was cold, we wore our hoods up as well. Around 9 p.m. now, we were roughly 5 minutes away from home when a police officer passed us, driving in the opposite direction. When the officer passed us, he looked at our truck skeptically and gazed through our windows. As we continued in opposite directions, the officer proceeded to make a U-turn, now heading in the same direction as we were. My father watched the officer do this and said to himself, "He's about to pull us over." Racing through my father's mind were any possible reasons as to why this could have been happening. Then it dawned on him as he looked to Caleb in the passenger seat. He began vigorously tapping Caleb's left shoulder and my right leg, waking us up out of our sleep. As we woke up startled, unaware of what was going on, my father yelled, "I told y'all not to wear those hoods in the car. Take them off." The officer pulled up behind our truck, lights flashing, as my father looked for a place to pull over. As he stopped the car, my dad began giving Caleb and me strict and urgent directions. Sit up straight, he said. Hands on your lap, palms up, look straight forward. The last thing he told us continues to echo through my mind to this very day. He told us, do not move no matter what. Almost magician-like, my father already had rolled the window down with his license and registration in the fingertips of his left hand. The left hand, obviously, because it is closer to the driver's side window. He did all of this prior to pulling the vehicle over. The officer approached, and my dad handed him his license and registration very, very slowly. Do you know why I stopped you? The officer asked. I absolutely do not, my father replied. The officer said, it looked like one of your license plate bulbs was out in the rear of your vehicle, and I could not read the plate. That's strange, my father said. I just replaced them last weekend. The officer took a look at my dad's license. Where are you guys headed? He asked. I'm taking my children home, officer. The officer then asked my father, do you all still live out here? First off, if we were initially driving in opposite directions, there's a very slim chance for the officer to notice a license plate bulb being out in the rear of our vehicle. Secondly, my father's license and registration clearly have our home address on them, which the officer clearly read before asking us if we still live out here. The officer spoke to my father in a manner as if we did not belong in the town we live in, as if we were outsiders. My dad, brother, and I were traveling in a vehicle that was properly registered and in working order. In reality, we're allowed to go wherever we please, as long as we are not breaking any laws or engaging in any suspicious activity. The basis of the officer's suspicions obviously had nothing to do with our actions. We were just black people at night with hoods on. I guess it's illegal to be black at night with your hood on, even when it's cold. The irony of the situation was that we were not even given a ticket. And when we returned home safely, my dad got out of the car and approached the rear of our truck to find both license plate bulbs perfectly lit and functional. Our rear license plate was as clear as day and visible. My family, my two older brothers, mom, dad, and me, moved out to Westminster in 2005, when I was about 2.5 years old. Since then, my father has been stopped 8 times in our town, most of the time in our own neighborhood. However, he has strangely never received one ticket. When we walk into our local grocery store, we are watched surreptitiously like criminals. White women clutch their purses, and white people urgently move their carts away from us when we walk by, as if we are attempting to prey on them for their possessions. Is my appearance threatening to you so much that you feel the dire need to clutch all of your belongings, spy on my every move, and look down upon me as if I am some sort of a violent creature incapable of rationality? As I watch the racial turmoil unfold in this country throughout this past summer, which still persists today, I'm disgusted. This poor treatment of Black people that is now being given national attention did not just begin in the spring of 2020, and it continues to take place, as we saw with the heartbreaking situation that took place in Kenosha, Wisconsin, just a week ago. This is a battle that the Black American has to unknowingly go through from the moment he leaves his mother's womb. The media illustrates Black people as hot-headed, irrational, violent, hypersexual, and uneducated. I watched a man lay helplessly handcuffed, face down with a police officer's knee pressed into his neck on the concrete of a Minneapolis street for nearly 8 minutes. What I am further sickened by is the response by some, as if the man's death is justified due to his past and the fact that he attempted to use a counterfeit $20 bill. By no means is that any reason to kill someone. Every time an unarmed Black person is murdered at the hands of the police in America, people bring up negatives of the person's past in an effort to justify why he or she was murdered. Then, at least as it seems, the officers tend to always get away with their actions. Dave Chappelle, a successful award-winning Black comedian from Washington, D.C., had this to say at the end of one of its Netflix stand-up comedy specials. If you don't understand that when a football player takes a knee during the national anthem, he's actually standing for me, then you might not want to mess with me anymore. Colin Kaepernick took a knee for me. He did not do it out of disrespect or ungratefulness towards those who fight for us every day. He took a knee for every one of my brothers and sisters who look like me, who are discriminated against every single day on American soil. He gave up everything he worked his entire life for in order for change. He did not only protest police brutality. Kaepernick took a knee so that someday Black people will not have to question how they should wear their own hair just so they won't be seen as unprofessional or thugs. He took a knee so that someday Black parents will no longer have to deeply contemplate what they choose to name their child, fearing whether or not it will look ghetto on paper when they go for a job interview. He took a knee so that Black children as young as 8, while their white friends get to carelessly enjoy themselves, will not have to learn how to interact with the police because they fit the universal description of an American criminal. He took a knee so that maybe, just maybe, people of all races, ethnicities, backgrounds, religious affiliations can live free of systemic prejudices. The great historic phrases, liberty and justice for all men are created equal, and even the phrase, all lives matter, have not captured the true meaning of all in any way. As a Black kid who attends a predominantly white private school, many Black students will agree with me when I say that we have to mentally prepare ourselves. As a guy who is seen as a pretty high-profile Black athlete on campus, I always have distrust in the back of my mind. Do these kids who I consider my friends really love me for me? Or do they love me for my culture and my basketball ability? Life should not have to be this way. I personally did not have to question the loyalty of my close friends here, but many kids who look like me are not so fortunate. We are forced to overthink about whether or not the people surrounding us truly value us as people. In a lot of cases, people love, appreciate, and value everything about Black people except for their actual humanity. Just take one look at social media and pop culture, and you will see the vast impact that Black culture has had on society. The way that people dress, the slang they use, even dances such as the whoa, the nay-nay, the dab, the shmoney dance, among a long list of others, have all become mainstream. Most notably, with the influence that rap music is having right now, most people would argue that it is the #1 most listened to genre in the world today. However, the same people who love the music we put out and the spectacle we provide on the basketball court and football field seem to remain silent during the times when we face injustices and even tell us to shut up and dribble. I recently came across a tweet by an anonymous Twitter user that has resonated with me every day since, because I feel that it represents the mentality I've come across with many white students who attend institutions like ours. The tweet read, quote, "It's always, I have a Black friend so I can say the N-word, but never, I have a Black friend so I fight for their equality," unquote. When we say Black Lives Matter, it does not at all mean that Black lives are more important than those who are not Black. The phrase is far from the idea that Black lives better. After seeing many peaceful protests in which people chant Black Lives Matter on social media, the most common chants I hear in response are, all lives matter, blue lives matter, and even USA. These responses let me know that Blacks demanding equality triggers and threatens these people. We obviously realize that all lives matter. However, all lives are not disenfranchised, racially profiled on a daily basis, and being killed for invalid reasons by police. I respect and thank all police officers from the bottom of my heart who took an oath to protect and serve. On the flip side, it is a dangerous job that one must be prepared for on a daily basis. I believe that police officers should not have to be prepared for death every day, but unfortunately, it's a part of the job. A Black person should not have to be prepared to be shot during a traffic stop, Philando Castile, or shot while being a 12-year-old boy playing, Tamir Rice, or shot in the comfort of their own home when the police have the wrong address, Breonna Taylor, whose murderers have still not been arrested after 6 months now. My father giving my brother and I such meticulous directions the night we were stopped is something that haunts me to this day, because my father acted as if he was prepared to be shot during a traffic stop. Should we really have to live this way? The last response to the protesters I have seen on social media is a repetitive chant of USA. This response tells me that racism is so deeply ingrained in the United States of America that when it is challenged and opposed, that is received as a threat to our country. In other words, the equality of Black people in this country is a threat to everything we stand for as a nation. Yes. When a person is not being listened to, the first thing he will presumably do is try to speak up a little louder. If he is once again not heard, then he will project his voice even more. If it happens again, he will project his voice even louder, possibly resulting in.
The reason why, so a few disclaimer. Number one, Breonna Taylor, we all know that the case has been going on and the officers were found, still, found guilty or not. And some officers were taken out of their posts and things like that. So there's some racial justice that was happening there. But I also wanted to show this video of this young man because, again, it speaks to the experience of a Black male. He was a student at Dorsey School. Dorsey is a school in Philadelphia. It's one of the top private schools in our country. And so you think about this basketball player. He speaks so eloquently, but when he's speaking, he's sharing his experience. And what I liked about his message was that his message wasn't one-sided. He gave credit where credit is due, but this is a Black man whom family apparently moved so that he can have a certain lifestyle. This is a Black man who drive an hour, I'm assuming very far, he said it in the video, to go home, but then have to go back to school and then to experience that. And the reason why I also wanted to show the video and I wanted this young man to speak, sorry if it was a little bit long, but I wanted him to speak because it goes back to the notion of understanding their perception and understanding how they really feel when they walk into the building. I am a woman, literally I'm 5'4", so I'm assuming average height. I remembered when I was at my college, way back when, there was this one professor. Every single time he stopped me, he asked me how basketball practice was going. I didn't know how to dribble a ball for a lick, right? But he kept asking me about basketball practice or good game. I'm like, I didn't even watch the game. So and again, that was way back then. I wanted to share that video because of that, and we could definitely talk more. So I'm going to share my screen again. Cancel. Are you able to see this? Yes. Okay, great. All right. So the terms to consider for today is emotional support, which is the ability to show empathy, compassion, and genuine concern for another person, right? And I stress empathy, right? Oftentimes we cannot sympathize with people who, if we don't have an experience, but we can empathize, right? We can see, we can understand affect, the way someone feels they are cared for. This goes back to perception. How do they feel that they're cared for? Affirmation is the emotional support or encouragement. What do we do as a school institution to show, to affirm who they are? One major thing that a lot of places, there are two words that I would like you to know. One is microaggression and one is microaffirmation. Microaggression happens every single day on a daily basis. Microaggression was, that professor who's constantly, oh, you play basketball, right? Or that microaggression of, this young man driving home with his parent. It's like there's microaggression. These young people, these black men, black students are going into school and they're being faced with microaggression every single day. I mean, and again, to codify today's presentation, I am not saying that other microaggressions do not happen within other contexts, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm speaking directly for the black students in school. And what happens is you counter microaggression with microaffirmation. So each time that there is microaggression, you affirm that individual with microaffirmation. And also aid. Aid is a term that I like. It's the tangible support services that's given to an individual. I have House, who is House and Gottlieb in 1981. They coined the theory of social support. This was a long study. And they actually used affect, affirmation, and aid to actually look at whether or not a group of participants were being emotionally, socially supported. And you can also add this to emotional support as well. Tangible supports oftentimes is linked to financial assistance, or it's linked to, free or reduced lunch, or, making sure that there's an after school program for students and things like that. But tangible support is important, yes, but what does that mean as far as the emotional support? What does that mean as far as taking the individual student? It's okay to say, well, we know that so-and-so parents work until 5 o'clock. So we're going to have an after school program where they can go to an after school program, but that's still not enough. What happens in the after school program? What kind of programs are you going to have in the after school program? What kind of follow-up are you going to have? And then another thing that we're going to consider today is this notion of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality. If she is, for me, when I was doing my studies, intersectionality really helps to understand who the person is, what individual identity that person is carrying into the room. So the intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, ability. In this case, I wrote race, class, and gender, as they apply to an individual or group regarding overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. For instance, in our school, we tend to see a Black student, but we also need to take a step back and look at the Black student as to the intersected areas that they identify with. So for instance, I'm a Black woman. However, I'm a Black Jamaican woman. I'm a cisgendered female. I'm physically abled, right? My upbringing, economic status, all of those things play a role. And it's really important for us to understand that when we look at the Black student in our school, especially when we want to tie in their experience, their perception. So this is a slide. Am I blocking everyone with this? Okay, on intersectionality, you see the person, ability, gender, sexual orientation, class, ethnicity, and race. For the sake of this presentation, I did not go into detail as to what the primary dimensions are or the secondary dimensions are, but it also plays a huge role as to what the individual person's primary dimension is. When I was doing my research, of course, I was researching the experience of Black males. What I thought that was interesting was when I did the focus groups with the Black participants, there were Black participants who actually said, you know what, Mrs. Thomas, I consider myself a Black man, but what was more prevalent, what stood out for me the most when I was at this school was the fact that I was a Black gay student. So then I said, what does that mean? Well, in addition to being Black, I was also gay. So that takes into consideration as well class. That was a huge thing, right? This whole notion of socioeconomic status. And another thing that happens too is that we tend to clump all Black students together, but there's some Black students who are coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And so their experience is quite different as well. A matter of fact, I feel, and this is just from, observation, I have not necessarily done studies on this, but I feel that a Black student in a predominantly white school who comes from an upper class has a sense of invisibility. Because what tends to happen is that our unconscious bias becomes conscious bias when we approach these students. And so we clump all of them together without fully understanding their intersectionalities. So when we speak to their experience, if we do not individually allow ourselves to understand who they are, we then tend to make assumption. Does that make sense? Right? So what I wanted to share with you was, I wanted to share with you the true testimonials from the participants in my study. My study consisted of 12 participants, Black males, who went to the school, graduated, went on to college, or was in post-grad. And I asked them about emotional support as it pertained to their peers, their teachers, and the administrators. And where you see participant 5, participant 12, I just still wanted to give their voice to it. I did not want to speak for them. So emotional support from peers, one said, if I ever needed support, I could go to my teammates. My teammates within my grade were there for me whenever I needed help, whether it related to our sport or not, with life issues or serious talks. I could go to my 4 best friends who weren't on the track team. Next one says, while not everyone is your best friend, I have fostered a group of 6 guys whom I speak to regularly. 5 years post-grad. I can attribute a substantial part of my personality and academic success to these men. We are competitive, but most importantly, we genuinely care for each other. And another participant said, I knew I could call on them to help me study, provide advice, or simply have my back, right? And then what I extracted from their perception of emotional support from teachers, a lot of them felt I was so fortunate to have teachers who opened their doors for me, like before and after school. Teachers were always there to lend a helping hand. They cared about me as a student and a person. The other one said, many of my teachers welcomed me in their classrooms outside of class hours to speak with me, not only about academic related topics, but just to be a support for me and sometimes just to give advice. And another participant said, I look to use my teachers as a resource and serve another purpose outside of just sitting in and leaving as soon as class ends. My teachers from years prior always extended an invitation for me to visit them to chat, and they always let the door open for me in times of trouble. What I thought was interesting with this, though, was when I asked the participants to elaborate, a lot of them said that they felt the teachers had to do that because it was in their contract, that they had to have office hours. So they were still kind of torn between whether or not it was really happening organically or if their office hours were open. But needless to say, they still had that. I did not include that in my research because that's research on top of research. That's additional research that needed to happen. So I did not want to make that assumption, but yes, that was definitely shared. Now, this was the most interesting part. When I asked about emotional support from administrators, some said, I had relationships with most of the members, but considering their role, they were in charge of the entire student body and function of the school community. So understandably, they didn't have time for my problems or emotions whenever I needed someone to cheer me up or give me words of advice. They also said, by virtue of my affiliation with the SEED diversity program, so that's the program, the diversity program that was in their school, I felt supported. However, that was not nearly enough to affirm me as a Black man. And then one of the participants said, I believe that there was an overemphasis from the administration as it pertains to emotional support. It seemed that even though it was a predominantly white school, there was a spotlight on the minority to graduate. It seemed to be something that padded their numbers, but it was difficult to not see their support as a charity case. So even though On a micro level, they were definitely supported by their peers who looked like them. They were supported by their teachers because of the open door policy, although it was in question a bit as to whether or not it had to be. But when it came to the administrators, they felt that they were heard and they were emotionally supported by the inner circle, but the institution as a whole, they did not feel like they were supported. So that brings me to my next slide, is how then do we move from inclusion to inclusivity, right? And sometimes we so in most predominantly white schools, we focus on diversity and inclusion. We're working on the equity piece, right? We're working on the equity piece, but we focus on diversity and inclusion. One of the ways that we focus on inclusion is we make sure that we retain, we want to get in students, most students. In the public schools, we are dealing with systemic inequities. A lot of public schools, I know in Connecticut, they're zoned. So if you do not live within a certain mile radius of the school, you can't go to the school. And so we have a deeper systemic issue on hand. In private schools where there is a selection, there is this notion of getting the students in because of inclusion. Someone once said to me, you think about diversity, you think about inclusion, and you think about belonging. So now you have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the B in belonging is actually what most people are focusing on. So diversity gives you this notion that everyone is represented. We're going to make sure that any box you could check off, we're going to have someone that's going to be represented in that box. Equity is, yes, we're going to make sure that every single person has the same amount. Inclusion is everyone from the checkbox will be in the room. They'll have the same amount of cookies, because then now they're going to feel included. But belonging is allowing everyone to bring something to the party and giving them the space to share it. Right? So then we get to inclusive. So inclusion, I actually did not get these definitions by myself. I recently finished the diversity and inclusion course at eCornell. And one of the courses is entitled Fostering an Inclusive Environment. And I thought this was the best definition for me, at least, because I understood it more reading it this way. And inclusion is a relational construct. It is about how your institution functions and performs based on the quality of social connection. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but a climate of inclusivity is when the entire norm of the institution speaks to the fact that it is promoting experiences of both belonging and the uniqueness for its members. So this goes back to the notion of understanding the Black experience of Black students in predominantly white school by asking them. One of the things that we tend to do is we want to have affinity groups, right? That's a big one of the major piece. We want to have affinity groups. But within the affinity groups, how do you then contextualize this notion of inclusion to inclusivity? Just having the affinity group is a show that the institution is working towards inclusion. But inclusivity will be within that affinity group to look at the diversity within diversity of who is in that group. Because then that allows you to get the full experience of who the student is. So some of my implications, I'm going to try to, I can't see. My implications is educational leaders need to continue to find evidence of practices that facilitated transition to like higher education. Oftentimes, if a student is in a school and by the time they graduate, the perception that they have from being in that school is going to translate, is going to carry over into their college. So if we emotionally support them, or school after, because not everyone has to go to college, everyone doesn't have to follow that path, but we have to, that notion of self-efficacy, that notion of self-fulfilling prophecy plays a role. Educational leaders need to find evidence of practice that best supports Black students in predominantly white schools. In conclusion, it is pivotal. This is a pivotal moment for predominantly white schools to provide emotional support for Black students, so they may be elevated in a space where they are underserved, especially if we're in private schools. A lot of these students are coming from different environments, but if we really want to understand the Black student, we can't just understand the Black student in one way. We have to be able to speak to their experiences. We have to be able to develop best practices that speak to who they are. We also have to affirm. The affirmation of Black students is incumbent upon the institution to critically reflect and have honest conversations about whether they are meeting the need of this racial group. Now, the reason why there's, I say honest conversations, but honestly, it's really courageous conversations. We want to be able to put ourselves in a place to have courageous conversations. There is a Glenn Singleton speaks about ways to have courageous conversations. Courageous conversations comes in with allowing someone to come in authentically, in their authentic self, creating a space for people to share, creating a space for people to be heard, creating a space to allow yourself to be uncomfortable. And those are my references. I know this was pretty quick. I probably spoke really fast. And I stopped sharing. And I'm just going to check the chat. I will share the link. I'll do that. Thank you, Stacy. I will share the link. Does anyone have any questions? You could you know what, if you can can you raise your hand on your screen, and then I could see there's like a little button, but I could see you. I do, so because I want to respect the way your name is pronounced, if it's possible, if you can pronounce your name first. Okay, thank you so much.
May I?
Yeah, yes, yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm Raphael. I identify as he. I worked and have worked for and was a student at a predominantly white institution as well, and have been for 20 years. And I was fired up when I was, as you were presenting, because it speaks so much to what I've dealt with and continue to deal with, the students that I mentor as well, what they're dealing with. And that young man's speech was absolutely just amazing. And I'm going to share that with my students so they can identify. I did learn something from you today, and that was, I've never really thought about the difference between inclusion versus inclusivity. And you really laid it out in a way that made a lot of sense. And then the belonging aspect, which is something that seems to be morphing into the DEI as we defined it. And I wonder, from your research, now you got the black male perspective, or black man perspective, and you talk about your experience, your background with the black woman perspective as well. Are you finding links between the experiences of the black man experience and the black woman experience, and what are some of the implicit attitudes that both populations are experiencing, both gender, men and women, and non-binary as well?
Yes, that's a very good question. That is, for me, what I do find is that the Black male experience, and this is just from the research, is that Black men, especially, students, everything is optical, right? They want to see what's happening. They want to see themselves represented, whether or not it's in the media, or whether or not it's in, the curriculum, and things like that. What I do find when I speak to young Black men, is that they're still so, the trauma that they experience on an everyday, it's really hard for them and they still grapple with it. What I do find with Black women is that they speak a little bit more victorious. They speak a little bit more hope, they have more hope, it seems. And I'm not sure if it's just optically they have this representation. But what I will say is that the Black experience, whether or not it's male or female, in predominantly white schools resonates the same way. But I do find a sense of, when I do speak with Black males, I do find a sense, I don't want to say hopelessness, but it's difficult. It's difficult. And I could just assume that the burden that they carry, because you're looking at the other intersectionalities that they carry with them, they're expected to be the father, the provider, they're expected to be this person, that person. So they still carry that with them, but then they look at a system that is just counter or is trying to keep them down, according to this young man in the video. Yeah, so that's what I see. As a Black woman myself, I am big on this notion of intersectionality. And I always say to my friends, I cannot fully understand the experience of a Black American. I am not Black American. I can empathize, but I can't fully have that experience. As a Black woman who is educated, as a Black woman who speaks, I hope I speak okay. As a Black woman who have this, I do get where people put me in another category. And that is that notion of that unconscious bias and that conscious bias and how our brain filters things in and out. So I do know that people put me in this category of, oh, she can do it, so why can't they all do it? She did it. And I'm like, well, I'm an immigrant. There's a difference between coming to this country versus being colonized by the country. There's a different psychological effect that takes on someone. So for instance, during the time of George Floyd, my husband I have a Black man, my husband is Black, identifies Black. And, I will go in, I'm like, I can't believe they're doing this. I don't get it. And I'll try to talk to him. And he said to me one day, he said, Alecia, I'm not trying to offend you, but you will never understand what I'm going through as a Black man. And I had to stop and say, you're absolutely right. He said, you'll never understand what I go through as a Black American. I had to step back and say, you're right. He said, but I will tell you, you do understand what I go through as a Black person. And the same way he could never understand what I go through as a Black woman. So yes, but what I do find is that I feel it seems to be, and again, it seems that Black men, especially our young Black men, it seems like they carry it a little differently. I think that's the best way to say it. They carry it a little differently. And Black women carried a little differently too. But because my study was on really Black men, they still carry that burden, and they carry the burden of trying to get it right for some reason. And what's disheartening is, I don't know how you get it right when the system, how do you get it right? Why do you have this on your shoulder to correct systemic inequity? So yes, thank you for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I'd love to talk to you beyond this, but we got to talk. We should talk.
Thank you. Colette, hopefully I said that correctly. Please correct me if I did not.
That is right, Colette. That's fine. How would you speak to, we are in elementary school, so we have middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, plus the toddlers through 5th graders, but specifically the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. How is there a different road to take, different path?
Yes. So Beverly Tatum, amazing woman. She actually has a book, and she actually speaks on the identity and race and how you approach this with the younger population. With the younger students, like the toddlers on up, I want to say to like 3rd grade, it's all about identity and this notion of affirmation. So I had this question posed to me the other day. So yeah, I think things happen for a reason, because I think somewhere in the universe, you were going to ask this question. And someone said, you know, it was a white teacher who was struggling with how to teach Black History Month, right? So literally her question was, I'm struggling with how to teach Black History Month. I don't know what to do. I talk about MLK. They have a touch board, I guess in that grade, there's a touch board. And she put a picture of MLK up and asked the students, they were kindergarteners and first grade. And she asked them who this person was and they couldn't tell her. And so she said, how then am I supposed to tell them about MLK? And I said, you don't tell them about MLK. See, that's one of the issues, is that we talk about Black history in February. Why? This is something that should be integrated throughout the entire year. And it's this notion of belonging. So one of the things I always say to teachers or educators or anyone who's in front of a class, take an inventory of your class. Start off talking about family heritage. And students will tell you who they are. And then what you do is, in every single lesson that you teach, you think about belonging. You think about how you allow that child to bring that into the lesson. Because at that age, it's about identity. It says that unconscious bias becomes conscious bias in the years of early socialization, which means that the first two teachers to a child, the first two people that a child sees are their parents and their teachers. There are some studies who actually says the teachers give them more than the parents, because parents sometimes want to shelter their child, so they don't tell their kids too much. But imagine you have a white teacher in the class. Now it's February. They're talking about MLK, right? And they're talking about Rosa Parks not moving to the front of the bus, and the civil rights and the dogs and and those things happen. And they're talking about the fact that we're still happy. Imagine that child, and for the first time, the child is learning that because of the color of my skin, all of this happened. Right? So that's difficult. But if you utilize this notion of identity throughout the entire curriculum, when you get to Black History Month, of course, talk about Black History Month. Black History Month happened for a reason. But by that time, they're not learning about it in such a way that it's hard for them. Now, when they get to, so they say identity, but pretty much between K through 3. Students still understand difference. They know that my hair is longer versus your hair is shorter. A child in preschool doesn't understand I'm Black and you're white, right? Honestly, they say, for white people, they say peach. If you say to a child you're Black, they're gonna pick up a crayon and put it to your face. I'm like, you're not Black, you're brown. But what we can do is we can help them to appreciate and love the skin they're in. You can do things like making sure you have multicultural markers. You can do things like making sure you have multicultural construction papers. You can do things like doing multicultural paint, having them mix their skin. There's a book called The Color of Me. There's a book called Just Like Me. So you can do that, because what happens is that they still understand the differences, but then they're allowed to share their differences. Now, when they get to middle school, that is when they first started put it together. So yes, that is when you tackle like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, that is when you tackle this notion of first impressions, stereotypes, what is this? And you start off with saying stuff like, we're going to do a first thought activity. We're going to, I'm going to say police officers, and you write down what everything that you think of. I'm going to say this, and you write down everything you think of, and then you share. One of the things I will say with the middle schoolers, though, is that you have to establish norms for that conversation. Establishing norms are key. First, you develop your norms, and then you allow them to implement their own norms. And then you do follow through. And this is also, if you are in a group with students who you're speaking about and they're the marginalized group, you want to ask them for permission before you tackle this topic, whatever topic it is. But yes, but if the younger ones, it's all about identity, it's all about loving yourself, it's all about belonging, it's all about seeing yourself in the classroom. For the middle schoolers, it's really allowing them to understand themselves within the context of what these isms are, because by the time they get to high school, they're ready to unpack, they're ready to scaffold, but they're already having their emotions. What happens though is that With DEI, we didn't do that. And then they get to high school, and then we look at these young people and we're surprised when they're so emotional, right? And then we're like, oh no, now we got to have this conversation. And so we're reacting instead of being proactive. Oh, I do see some questions. How can white educators support Black and POC students in pre-dom? How do we ensure that the support of parents of support of POC students does not only fall on faculty? You're absolutely right. It has to be, thank you for this question. This is a really great question. It has to be a sense of, I want to give Julia, thank you, Julia. It has to be a sense of institutional. It has to stem from the institution. It has to be within the language. One of the things that I'll ask is, does your school have an equity statement? Does your school meet regularly to discuss whether or not the institution is aligned with the equity statement? And also too, is the equity statement aligned with the mission? But you're right, it cannot just fall on faculty. And one of the things that that I thought was interesting was this, when in March, love this book, White Fragility, but a lot of teachers were given this book to read, and it was a good book. But from having conversations, you have a lot of white faculty who, for the first time, they were grappling with race and what that meant for them. And I thought about that and I said, if white teachers are grappling with race and what it means for them, how then can we expect them to be in front of a classroom and talk to this? I mean, can you imagine? And also a lot of white teachers were understanding who they're, reading White Fragility was such an eye-opening book. And a lot of white faculty for the first time were looking in the mirror, and saying, oh my gosh, and was mad and going through the emotions, and why didn't they teach me this? So I do think it has to be institutional buy-in. It cannot just be the faculty who are expected to teach. Would you recommend affinity groups for students in grades 6 through 8? I would say not. I will say yes and no. Oh wait, I'm sorry, Annie, this was a private, this was a private one. I need to do better with this chat. I would say no, as far as affinity groups. I would say eventually yes, but to start off with a student of color group. Because I will start off with the students of color, the BIPOC group, and then within that group have affinity spaces. And okay, I think that's it for the chat. Oh, someone had their hand up, Jake.
Hi, Dr. Thomas. Thank you
Hi,
so
Jake, how
much.
are you?
I'm doing well today. Thanks for asking. Thanks for your offerings in your presentation and your slides as well. So I'm sitting with this idea that you brought up briefly about intersectionality and recognizing that students don't just wear one identity when they're sitting in our classrooms, when they're sitting in their clubs and organizations. They are full students with identities across the board inside of all like the big 9, right? And then also social identities, whether you're someone who likes sports or whether you're someone who holds identities of being a person of color and queer and socially economically disadvantaged. How do we create affinity spaces within affinity spaces, like you've been saying, that allow students to explore their identities that are intersecting, right? Is it useful to create a queer and trans person of color affinity space where folks can talk about sort of the intersections of those two identities? Is it then relevant to create, women in STEM fields of color, affinity space so that folks can all talk about those identities? And then also at what point does that fractionalization become too much? At what point have we broken off to these affinity spaces too far where students are not able to grow relationships because they're with 1 or 2 other people, and then they realize, wow, I really am alone in these identities at this institution, right? Because as we get more and more narrow, we then find that, there's not enough students to populate an affinity space so specific, even though it might be exactly what that student needs in terms of restoration, emotionally, spiritually, etc. Any thoughts on that would be really helpful for me. Thank you in advance.
That is a very, very, very good question. I will say that to always start off with the umbrella group. So for instance, we know there's intersectionalities within the LGBTQ plus community. I'll start off there. If you start off with the LGBTQ plus group, depending on your school too, right? You want to take an inventory, kind of like a informal inventory of some sort. You start off with the group, and then within that group, you speak to affinity spaces. You mentioned, let the group come together first, talk about supporting each other, what that means on the umbrella. But I do believe that you should have affinity spaces within that group because of the intersectionality. Like for instance, if you have, I remembered when I went to college, right? College was the first time in my entire life. I came from Jamaica. I was 11 years old. Lived in Hartford, Connecticut, which I'm not sure if anyone of you guys know, but I lived in Hartford, Connecticut, very impoverished, single mom, but inner city school. So I'm the product of inner city education, public education. Then I went to Fairfield University, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with Fairfield University, but I mean, I watched 90210 on TV. I did not even know that 90210 existed in real life. That was the first time. And also too, I went to a school where I did not have one single white person in my class. I say all of this to say that in my college, we had, it was called AHANA then. So they had African American, Hispanic, Asian, Native American group. So of course, I'm a Black woman, so I went to the African American group. But I was lost because I was not African American. But within that group, what I was able to do, though, I was able to initially go to a place where people looked like me. But within that space, we broke off into West Indian group and things like that. But we always seem to come back together on on many occasions. So I will say, not to add more to your plate, but it's not, okay, we're going to meet now as the one big group. And then next week, we're going to meet with, these students who identify as this, and then we're going to come back. It kind of has to happen simultaneously in a sense. But I will say, yes, you have to definitely have affinity spaces within the big group. It's like diversity within diversity.
Could I ask a quick follow-up question? I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm thinking, is it best to have like faculty and staff run these affinity spaces, schedule logistics? Should we bring in like a DEI consultant, or can some of these spaces even be student-led in the ways that they operate? What are your advice on that?
Okay, so this is not my expert advice. This is just my advice as being Dr. Thomas, and this is what I will say with any institution. Before you bring in a consultant, you want to understand the climate of your school first. Because what it comes, it's like having someone on the outside come into your home and then tell you what you need to do. What if you liked your furniture over there? What if it was, what if you did not even take a look? So I wouldn't have an outside person. It's important for faculty to be a part of it, but not just any faculty. So you want to have a conversation with that faculty. So say, for instance, the Black affinity group, you just don't want to choose a Black faculty because he's Black and say, hey, now you're going to moderate this group. So you want to have this conversation. You want to really get permission from that faculty first. I would, however, say that when the group is meeting, that it is the faculty is the moderator, meaning the faculty is there to make sure that, the faculty serve as an interrupter. If there are ouch moments, the faculty sit back and listen and provide context when everything is going to the left, because, there are a lot of assumptions, but it should be student run, which is hard sometimes for us as faculty to just sit there. But we have to allow that conversation to unfold. But yes, I will definitely say someone within the school. I will definitely say a faculty who looks like them with permission, or a faculty who, and also to another thing that I will say too in affinity spaces is to allow depending on the affinity space, but allow allies. So the same way that you have these affinity spaces, have ally groups. So there's a group called, it's a big thing now, it's BARWE, BARWE, and it's actually building anti-racist educators, something, something. And it's also the same that it says that if you are going to have an affinity space, and you can't have affinity spaces for white people in a predominantly white school. That's another thing we got to get rid of. You don't have affinity space for people who are in it, who are in the majority, but you should also have a group for them to be able to discuss and have these conversations too, because it's only through courageous conversations, only through this notion of speaking through their fear. You know, a lot of white faculty, they say to you, but I don't know what to say, right? I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But it's, you know, so that happens through conversation. I think I had a question here. Hopefully it's not a private. Should the faculty moderator belong to the same identity group as the students? No. It depends on your institution and what is needed. However, if the faculty moderator does not belong to the group, they have to identify it with it, like maybe through knowledge, maybe through empathy, but they can't be in the room to learn. They can't, I mean, they can't expect the student to educate them. It's like, you know, you have a Black person who's called upon to do DEI work. Why? Because I'm Black. You know, granted, this is my job. I do this. This is what I do. But you always get, or if you're in a room and say, it's kind of like the same thing if you're in a classroom and the teacher's talking about slavery or anything like that. There's like that one Black kid, and then the teacher looks at the child and the child is like, what? That happened to me a lot. And I'm like, I don't know anything about Black American slavery. I'm learning for the first time. I'm from Jamaica. All I know was we were Arawaks and we defeated people and we were good. So it was, you know, it was a whole different. So yes, I will say, yes, you can. But the person who does not identify with the affinity space should be able to empathize. But I will say that you probably should find someone who identifies, because an affinity space is an affinity space for a reason. So if you're in a Black affinity space, you need to have a Black faculty in that affinity space, unless the school doesn't have a Black faculty, which is a whole nother research. If you have any questions, please feel free. Another thing too is, you know, what I present today wasn't anything new to the literature. The only thing that is new were my findings from my research. But with DEI work, you know, we all have a drive. And if this is your drive, if this is your passion to be to look at equity and to look at the disenfranchised, we're all in this together. And you know, it's all about shared collaboration. You know, it's about shared knowledge. So if you have resources that you would like to send my way, please do so. That only helps to build my library and makes me a better diversity practitioner for my students and for the people whom I serve. And I just thank you. I think Colette was here and a few other people in the beginning when I was saying this was my first ever presentation in this platform. And you know, you go through the experience once and then you're like, yes. So thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for giving me the platform today. And you have given me light and you have refueled my purpose as to why I'm driven to this work.